It almost seems silly to say, um, but ceramic was a revolutionary technology, and it's something that we obviously still use today. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that ceramics are used for, and pottery is still used for. But pottery goes back to the seventh millennium BC, so around 6900 BC to 6000 BC. Um, Pottery is the most common artifact now in archaeological sites in the Middle East. And really, in any area uh, where you have pottery, is going to comprise the largest collection of material at your site. And we talked about why that is. Pottery is breakable, so it has to be replaced. But ceramic itself doesn't wear away and doesn't deteriorate. And so a lot of it is going to stick around and not break down in the site. So pottery is usually associated with sedentism around the world. It's definitely associated with sedentism in agriculture in the Middle East. And archaeologists have proposed different reasons to explain why it was invented at a specific time. That is, was it technological? Did they need to have the technology? And that dictated that it was developed in the 7th millennium BC? Was there some sort of incentive to develop pottery? And we'll look at this. So in archaeological sites, you're going to have lots of emphasis on studying pottery from about, again, 7,000 BC all the way up to the present. You have pottery from Ottoman time periods on archaeological sites. So, up to the 19th century, you find pottery that you can date specifically to a time period. So archaeologists studied the decoration, the style, the way that the pottery was manufactured, the different kinds of vessels that were produced, to tell a little bit about the society. Okay, and you will find yourself touching, feeling, using ceramics every day. In the bathroom, right? Chances are your sink, if it's not made out of a plastic or fiberglass kind of material, it's probably made from porcelain. I think almost all the sinks and bathroom appliances I've seen at Grand Valley are porcelain or ceramic. You may have drank your coffee out of a ceramic coffee mug. Ceramics are used in high-tech magnets today. They're used in bulletproof vests and some of the inserts that are used in bulletproof vests. So what is ceramic exactly? Ceramic is a synthetic human-created substance. It is essentially, and most of you know this, clay that has been fired. The clay produces a chemical change. So it's not just, you know that if you take a piece of clay and you dry it in the sun, it will dry hard. But then if you put it back in water, it will get soft again. Once you fire clay, it remains hard permanently. So it involves pyrotechnology. It involves fire. Fire and clay, essentially, producing something that is a synthetic substance. What is clay? Well, clay, and you can see here, clay is essentially very fine particles. So you can see kind of coarse sand, right? All the different kinds of grains of sand, and this is in millimeters here. Right? So you can see when you get down to clay, the particle size is something like 0.02, less than 0.02 millimeters. So very, very small. Well, what that does is that allows water to be trapped in between the different particles. So when you mix clay with water, it's plastic. That is, it can be molded into different shapes. It's bendable, right? And that's one of the first great properties about clay. You can mold it into into all sorts of different shapes. You're only limited by your imagination. And then once you fire it, that thing becomes permanent. So those are the two important aspects of clay. We have clay deposits around campus near the ravines. There's clay. Essentially you're looking for very, very fine grained material that is plastic. It can be bent. Okay, now fired clay goes back way before pottery was developed. Pottery, we're talking about containers. Ceramic or fired clay is something else. Taking figurines and throwing them in the fire goes back to Ice Age Europe. Now, making containers from clay and firing them to be used for different purposes takes a few thousand years later to appear, but it probably appears in the Far East, in Japan, first in the world. So Japan probably has the very earliest pottery, and then in the Middle East, it's somewhere around the 7th millennium BC. So what is pottery good for? That might give us an indication as to why it was invented. What was the use of the earliest pottery? Maybe that tells us the incentive people had to develop it. Well, you probably know a little bit about these vessels, or you may have seen them before. These are called amphora. You'd see them in a lot of Greek and Roman shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. These were the standard container to transport liquids on board a ship during the Greek and Roman periods, the Hellenistic periods. And I'm sure you've heard that expression before, form follows function. That is a expression coined by Louis Sullivan, who is an architect. He was the teacher of Frank Lloyd Wright. And, what he said is true in many respects, especially for pottery. That is, different shaped vessels are good for specific things and not so good for other things. So this is a really good vessel for transporting liquids. It's got a very narrow opening, so you can close that opening and keep the liquids inside. It's got a very narrow base, so these things can nest together on the ship well. Because it also has a narrow base, you can shift it. If you're moving it, you might just be dragging that small part, let's say, than a big flat bottom jar. That would be much harder to move. So a container that is good for holding liquids, that will fit well inside a ship, and is pretty easy to move on and off a vessel. The amphora was developed. These different kinds of vessels can be used for different things. So, for example, something like small bowls. What do you think they might be used for? Probably serving, right? That is, eating and serving. You wouldn't use a bowl to store anything. It's open to the elements. You definitely wouldn't use it to store liquids long term. I don't know if any of you guys have a dog, but I have a dog, and I'm knocking over that water bowl on the floor several times a day and spilling water all over. So every day I realize bowls are not that great for long-term storage of liquids. They're good for serving, though. A bigger open-mouthed jar. So this would be like a jar and a bowl are different in the respect that a bowl, you can see the rim flares outwards, and the jar, the rim flares inwards. Well, you could have a narrow jar like this that we saw before with the amphora, or like this, and these are good for holding things, because storing liquids or storing other things, because you can close the opening pretty easily. You wouldn't want to use this for cooking, though, because if you put this vessel with some stuff in it that you want to cook on the fire, and the pressure builds up and you only have a small opening, you can guess what would happen, right? You would squirt out into your face or all over. So you really want something that's open. So something like an open-mouthed jar that's larger than one of these bowls would be good for cooking. You want it big enough so you can cook a good amount. You don't want a little bowl just to cook for one person. So these are typically the shapes for cooking vessels. These are typically the shapes for serving vessels. These are typically the shapes for storage vessels. So those are some things that pottery might have been used for. These are some large storage jars from the Palace of Knossos on Crete from the Bronze Age. So much later in time than what we're talking about right now. But you can see good-sized jars for storage. They even have these lug-shaped handles, probably to tie down the cover so you could keep it sealed. In North America, during the woodland period, you would find vessels like this. You could even see some burning on one spot or sooting on one spot of the vessel. This would be a good cooking vessel, something pretty large, pretty flat-bottomed, wide-mouth jar that shows evidence of having been touched by a fire. And the same with these vessels here. Something like this would be good for serving a drink in, right? So it's sort of like a conical shaped cup. You could also have ceramics that would be used for ritual purposes. This is actually an incense burner. It's hollow on the inside and it has these slits all around it. You would burn incense on the inside and the smoke would waft out of these little slits here. These are vessels that I excavated when I was in Turkey from a tomb from the early Bronze Age. And you can see lots of really finely made dishes that were buried with this person. A lot of them look like serving implements. So bowls, these kind of chalice-like serving implements, and a few jars. Okay. So we have storage vessels, right? Storage vessels would typically be larger with a restricted sort of opening. Cooking pots, again, would be more rounded, a larger opening. Same with food preparation. Serving would be, wide open bowls or maybe even plates. And transportation would be convenient things for stacking with handles that you would use to transport liquids like the amphora. There's also different types of clay. We don't get these different types until much later on, but you may have wondered the terms like terracotta and earthenware and stoneware, china and porcelain and things like that. You don't get that in the Near East. You do get that in history much later on, but something like terracotta would be sort of a coarse-grained clay that would be maybe not as highly fired as some of these other wares, which would end up being more porous. That would be typical of a flower pot or roof tiles or things like that. Earthenware might be a little more highly fired and be more impervious to water. Okay, so let's take a look at the Near East. So pottery is definitely connected with Neolithic villages, with domestication. Now, what was the incentive to develop it, and why was it developed at a certain time? Some people wonder, was it because of the technology, right? That is, did the technology appear at a certain time, and that's why they developed pottery then? Probably not. And the reason is that leading up to pottery, many of the elements of pottery were already in place. That is, the use of clay to make different things, such as figurines, that was already in place. The use of pyrotechnology was already in place to make lime plaster. The use of containers made out of stone or basketry was also in place before the development of pottery. And so all of those little innovations on their own were not enough. They all had to be combined together to actually develop ceramic pottery. But it looks like all of those things were there before they actually developed pottery. So why did they develop pottery? So they had these kinds of technologies. We saw in the pre-pottery Neolithic. We saw at Ain Ghazal they were making plaster, right? They had in the pre-pottery Neolithic B in the Levant. You have these kinds of things, which are called, vaisseau blanc or whiteware. These are essentially reed baskets that are covered over on the inside and outside with lime plaster. They were used as one of the earliest experiments in container technology. They weren't that great for many things, though, and they weren't as great as ceramics, obviously. So why did people put all of the technologies together? The use of clay, the use of fire, the use of containers, right? And create ceramic vessels. So it wasn't just because they had to wait for the development of different technologies. There must have been something else going on. Well, was it connected to agriculture because it was developed in the agricultural villages? Did they need pottery for storage to store their food? Or did they need pottery, or was an incentive to create pottery because of the advantages in cooking? Or were they using it to keep liquids secure, or maybe even trade liquids? Was it because pottery was a prestige good that leaders wanted, and so that was the incentive? Was it because there was competition between people, and that competition led to the development of pottery? Well, how can we figure it out? The way we could figure it out is to look at some of the earliest pottery vessels and try and narrow down and try and eliminate some of these possibilities. So when you look at pottery in the beginning in the Near East, you don't have a lot of large storage vessels. But you have things like this. You probably remember this from the PPNA. This is a granary, right? This is where they would store their grain with that raised floor to keep the grain dry. People in the Middle East much preferred pits and granaries to store their food. They didn't really use pottery to store their food, and there are no large jars from the site, from any of these early sites, that would be used for storage of grain. So, did they develop pottery in order to store grain? Obviously, well, we could probably rule that out. I'm not going to say 100%. Nothing's ever 100% in archaeology, but that doesn't seem likely based on the evidence. Okay, what about some of these other reasons? Cooking is a good possibility because without ceramic vessels, it's hard to boil stuff. It's hard to heat up liquids. You can do it. And in fact, there was an archaeologist who did an experiment because he saw one of these survival shows on TV where somebody boiled water inside of a plastic bottle, showing that as long as the bottle's not touching the fire, and as long as there's water in the bottle, it's not going to burn or melt. But it's difficult to do because what you have to typically do is heat up rocks and then put them into some sort of container like a leather sack filled with what you want to cook, and the rocks dissipate the heat and cook the contents inside. That is not as easy a process as what you see here. Direct heating, direct fire cooking. You take, and obviously you don't want a roaring fire, but, you want a pretty, like the hot coals and, simmering, kind of like a crock pot almost. And you would place your vessel with its contents. Here you can see, the bowl with a little bit of cover on it and some rocks to support it. And you could easily cook a big stew. You could clarify butter that you get from, the butter you get from your animals. You could cook up cereal grains so that they would be soft. You can make something like a porridge. And there is evidence that people started to move towards this kind of diet because at Abu Huraira in the PPNB, they found lots of wear on the teeth, as we said before, from the bread that they were making that had a lot of grit in it. Well, in the 7th millennium, the levels at Abu Huraira later than the PPNB, in the Pottery Neolithic time periods, you see cavities in people. And the cavities are coming from soft, starchy foods in their diet, mainly things like a porridge. So eating a big bowl of oatmeal is different from eating bread that has a lot of sand and grit in it. So you see that dietary change, and that probably indicates that they were beginning to cook and to use these pots for cooking. So there's definitely some advantages, and we see bowls like that in early pottery Neolithic sites in the Middle East. We don't have lots of jars that seem to be used for trade. So it doesn't look like they developed pottery so that they could trade liquids to other areas. We do have a lot of bowls, flat plates that are highly decorated later on, right? So the earliest Neolithic pottery is pretty simple, but quickly they figure out how to decorate it. So the earliest pottery are lots of bowls, lots of small bowls, medium bowls, large, wide-mouthed jars for cooking, and plates. Well, so you put that together, and you're talking about essentially it being used, or these things being used for cooking and serving. Now, in what context, this is where you have to think anthropologically for a second, in what context would you have really finely made vessels being used to serve food, and also big bowls to cook lots of food? And we're not just talking about family meal here at the end of the day. This is something beyond that. What would you think is going on here? Or what would you think the context would be that these objects would be used in? Well, some people think feasting. Just like what we talked about with these big men and big women societies in the Pacific, in Polynesia and Melanesia, where prestige comes from giving. A lot of the prestige ceremonies involve gift giving of food. And so what might be going on here, and the development of pottery might be linked to maybe the importance of big men and big women, of early leaders of some sort, and the importance of feasting within the community, bringing people together, and the need to be able to cook large amounts of food, and the need to be able to serve this food to lots of different people. And also, it's not just the ability to serve people, but serving them in this kind of ceramic is also probably an important part of it. If you ever get the chance, some of you guys may have been to Meyer Gardens here and may have seen the Japanese garden. I would highly recommend it if you can go. In the Japanese garden in Meyer Gardens, they have a Japanese tea house. It's like a reconstruction of a traditional Japanese tea house. And I think a few days out of the year, they actually have a tea ceremony inside. And I think it was for like my wife's birthday a couple years ago. I got us a couple of seats. There were only like 10 people allowed inside to partake in a traditional Japanese tea ceremony. And they had women from the Japanese consulate in, I believe it was Detroit, come and talk about the tea ceremony, give us tea as you would have in a traditional tea ceremony. And I remember one of the elements they talked about is that they gave us these really cool bowls. They were like Roku pottery. I think it's called Raku pottery. Roku is different, Raku pottery. And they said part of the ceremony involves complimenting the person who's serving the tea on the bowl, and the container comes in, and sort of appreciating not just the tea, but also the container that it's served in as well. So you might say something like, "This is such a beautiful vessel," even before you drink any of the tea. So this is something that is probably part of the feast as well. Not just the food, but also the containers serving the food. And pottery then quickly becomes more and more commonplace. Now, as we're going to see, the early pottery is highly decorated. And then as societies get larger and larger and larger, it's just not feasible to decorate vessels, the amount of vessels that you need for the kind of population that you have. And so it's kind of counterintuitive than what you might expect. But over time, vessels actually become less decorated. So the most decorated vessels sometimes are the earliest vessels. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the developments of the pottery Neolithic in the Near East. We're going to first look, we'll talk about the differences between northern Mesopotamia and southern Mesopotamia, and then we're going to look at these different cultures.